I'll get to all that. Thanks, Shalana. Thanks to Kyoto Jolt, Gretchen, Thomas, everyone who was involved in putting this together. I was only able to be at part of BJ's talk, although I know BJ pretty well at this point. But this seems like it's really the kind of thing, the kind of conversation that need to be having had. That grammar doesn't make any sense. Okay. So what I'm going to do is it's PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to go through it, and then it really moves into sort of a breakout room situation because I'm going to pose some questions that I want you all to talk about that don't really work with this many people at the same time. It's just not going to work. We could try to do it and we would fail. So you're going to do that, and then we'll come together. And what I try to do is I try to bounce between the rooms as much as I can and pull out what I think people are talking about. And then we just sort of like bring things together and talk about them all together. You will see that I mentioned some of the same things VJ mentioned because, we do, related work. In fact, I cite VJ in it, so hopefully you're not too bored. But all right. So basically, this presentation is based on, there's an expansion of an article that I had published in May of 2020. And that article I wrote last January between my semesters. And just by chance, accident of history, it was published the week after the uprisings of 2020 started. So people really started wanting to talk to me about it. So I developed this talk that usually you do the academic talk, you're really just sort of doing the article, and you can read the article, right? I tried to place it in a little bit more context, to surround it with something more interesting, and then pull it into some suggestions after the fact, things that aren't really just in the text. Because frankly, if it was just the text, that wouldn't be very interesting, even though that's what people tend to do at conferences anyway, and that's why a lot of them are not very good. So let's get going. Oh, myself, right. My name is JPB Gerald. I am an EDD student. Can't call myself a candidate for a few more months, but I'm pretty much at the comps point. I am getting an EDD in instructional leadership, which is a meaningless phrase, but basically I am focusing on language teaching, racism, and whiteness, as they mentioned. I'm an adult educator also, although I don't teach the language right now. I spent about 9 or 10 years doing that, and we'll go back to it at some point, but these days it's mostly the focus of my writing, scholarship, and my podcast, although that tends to be whatever I want it to be about, which is called Unstandardized English. And I'll put a link in there at the end to that. Yeah, let's get going. Okay. So let me slideshow this. You will see that there are subtitles at the bottom. They're not very good. Sorry about that. So, Worth the Risk Towards Decentering Whiteness in English Language Teaching is the name of the article and therefore the presentation. So I live on unceded Munsee Lenape and Canarsie land, which you probably know better as Queens, New York. This is the point of all of this. From the beginning, the imposition of English on place names, even and in teaching the language, has always been a tool of oppression and erasure, dating back from how the indigenous in the United States and in many other countries where English is spoken and the enslaved were forcibly assimilated. The whole history of this language being pushed on people has really been wrought with oppression. So I want to situate this presentation in that history and reality. So the agenda for this presentation, I'm going to go over some terminology, some of which you heard in BJ's presentation, some of which you've probably heard around your discussions, but I want to give you my take on how these words should be and are used, or the way that I use them. I'm going to talk about how whiteness is centered in English language teaching, the impact of that centered whiteness, which touches on some of what BJ said, and then the work of decentering whiteness. How do we actually do something about this? Because sometimes I think academic presentations just say, look at this problem, and they don't do anything about it. And then we're going to have a discussion, both the breakout rooms and a larger discussion between everybody. Let us continue. So, terminology. So what do we call people who aren't white? Now, these words are a little bit different from country to country. I speak from a United States context, so you may have slightly different words where you are or where you're from, but these are the words that I'm focusing on. So if someone's not white, we could call them non-white, right? That's not inaccurate, okay? But I prefer not to use that phrase because it's defining people by what is centered. Yes, if you're simply describing everybody who's not white, you could say non-white, but I prefer to be more specific. When I talk about these words here, none of them are particularly offensive or upsetting, but they're either not specific enough or not really productive in terms of having a really substantive conversation. So I move away from non-white. Over here, you will see POC or BIPOC. Some other places in like the United Kingdom, for example, they say BAME. POC stands for people of color, if you don't know. BIPOC stands for Black and Indigenous people of color, or Black, Indigenous, and people of color. People have debates about where the and should go. These are terms of solidarity. So some people say that they don't like using these terms because they are not specific or they're ways for people to avoid using specific words. And I understand that and I agree with it. But I do want to be clear that these phrases, people of color and Black, Indigenous, and people of color, were created by people of color. So they're usually, if you're going to describe everybody who's not white, these are some of the best terms to use, although I still prefer not to use them because they still don't really call into play the oppression that's involved in racialization or the creation of races. So they're fine, but they don't quite get at what I'm trying to get at. Down here, you will see, and I'm sorry if you can't quite see it, the word minoritized. Now, minoritized, that eyes, right, is useful because you will see on many documents, whether it's the United States, whether it's Australia, or a lot of places where they speak English, where English is dominant, minorities, right? Minorities. Well, many of you would know why we shouldn't say minorities anymore. Who can say it's offensive? Because technically it might be true, right? A numerical minority. There's fewer of a people. How could one say that that is wrong? Well, let's think about, for example, indigenous people in the United States or in Australia, right? At some point, they were not the numerical minority, right? They lived there by themselves. And then some people came and somehow they were no longer the majority. So when you say minoritized, you're basically saying that these people have had power or land or wealth or whatever taken from them. So minoritized groups aren't necessarily the numerical minority. They might be, they might not be, but they are the people with less power and who've had power taken from them or denied to them. Another good example would be something like South Africa, where Black people, or what we would consider Black people, are obviously not the numerical minority there, but for hundreds of years, people we would consider Black have had less power. And so therefore they would be minoritized. The only reason I don't always use minoritized when talking about race and racism is that minoritized is not specific to race, right? You can say racially minoritized if you want to be more specific, but you can be minoritized and be of different gender expressions, different gender identities, right? You can be minoritized and be of a different class or something like that. So minoritized is a very useful word, but it's not specific to race. Marginalized is similar to that over here. Marginalized you probably heard of before, right? And it does call into play what has happened to people, what has been happening to people, but it's not specific to race. You can be marginalized and be of different gender expressions, of different sexualities and so forth. So again, it's just not quite specific enough. So as VJ used several times, this is why I think the word racialized is very important, because it's explaining, even without you necessarily noticing it, that the concept of race, the construction of race, was decided upon by some folks a while ago, right? And so it also shows that the concept of race shifts depending on where you actually are. If you are, as VJ mentioned, in Europe, different groups are considered racialized to where they might be in a majority white country, like, for example, the United States. I said majority, but I mean majoritized white country like the United States, right? Groups that are racialized in the UK may be racialized differently in the United States. And this really makes you think a little bit more about what you're saying about these groups. You're saying, what am I talking about? What does this have to do with language teaching? Well, I think it's important to set the stage before I go into some real discussion about words related to race. Speaking of which, a topic that everybody loves, racism. So racism is, one would hope you know, racial discrimination plus societal oppression. Anyone can experience the former as in racial discrimination, right? I could tell you I don't want to have any white friends. I wouldn't say that, but I could say that. That would be mean, but it's not societal oppression because I don't have any power over you just because I said that. And only certain groups can experience the latter. Which groups can experience the latter? Well, that's where racialization comes in, and it depends on the context and so on and so forth. However, regardless of that, everyone, you, me, whoever, can sadly help perpetuate racism. Oh, I already said the you and me part, right? So all of us have made decisions that have perpetuated the system of racism, whether we've wanted to or not. And that's something we have to grapple with. That's not to get us like, oh, we're all guilty, so none of us can do anything. It's just tell us that we have to think deeply about our choices and how they impact the system that we are a part of. There's many forms of racism, and I think sometimes it's important to think more specifically about the type of racism we're talking about. Because if you just sit here and say racism itself, then you will get people say, well, that person isn't white and that person isn't white, so is that racism, right? So it's important to think about anti-Black racism or anti-Asian racism or anti-Muslim racism. I know Muslim isn't technically a race, but remember, race is a construct, and the way that Muslims are described, especially in the English language, is very similar to the way that other groups of races are described. And I call upon Muslim scholars who tell me that it's considered racism, and I will defer to them on it. Another thing to mention is don't say race when you mean racism. You'll see news stories in English, especially, to say that this person was killed because of their race. This person was fired because of their race. No, no, no. They were fired because of the person's racism, right? Nothing has ever happened to anybody because of their race. It happened because of racism. Moving on, anti-Blackness, which is basically another way of saying anti-Black racism, and BJ hinted at this a second ago. What this is, as you might understand, oppression of Blackness, of Black people, of Black languages. And when I say Black languages, I also mean the way Black people use languages. So that, of course, includes English, and then Black bodies. We talk a little bit about hair and stuff like that. This is one of the most historically reliable paths to whiteness, whether you're talking about United States, UK, any place where whiteness is in the majoritized power position. For example, at least in the United States, Irish and Italian immigrants about 100 years ago, they became police, and we all know that police and anti-Blackness go hand in hand. Other European immigrant homeowners, when the suburbs became a big deal in the United States in the 40s and the 50s, well, the suburbs, most of them did not allow Black people in there. But if you, as a European immigrant, became part of these suburbs and helped keep Black people out, you were much closer to being considered white. Right? This is not to say everybody in these groups did all of these things, but this was a identifiable trend in these communities, and it's one way that people have gotten closer to whiteness. So if people wonder, for example, why 2 of the cops in the George Floyd murder were not white, well, it's because anti-Blackness gets you closer to whiteness. White supremacy, this is kind of obvious, right? It's the idea that whiteness is superior to other racial groups. But I bring up white supremacy to make a contrast between, well, what some on the public stage, for example, former presidents, are advocating is not just white supremacy, but specifically white nationalism, right? You can sit in your house and be a white supremacist and just not like people from other races. But white nationalism is wanting and working towards, its policy working towards a white ethno state, a state where there are pretty much only or almost exclusively white people existing in power, owning everything, etc. So that includes building a nonsense wall to keep people out, or leaving the European Union for no good reason and ending up in a worse position because you just don't want the immigrants there, right? That's white nationalism, which is just a more specific version of white supremacy. I bring up white supremacy and white nationalism, though, to talk about whiteness, because that is the point. The main point I'm trying to make here is that the concept of whiteness from approximately, although it's debatable, the 16th century was created specifically to be supreme, right? They had to create a group of people who were not going to be subject to colonialism, who were not going to be subject to enslavement or the Atlantic slave trade. And they had to create this group, and that's where whiteness came from as a concept. Obviously, there were people, if we look back 2,000 years, who now we would classify as white, and they used the word white to describe their skin. But all of the concepts, all of the epistemology, all of that was codified in the 16th century, and it was created to be the top of a pyramid, the center of a circle. There is no functional difference then between whiteness as a concept, as an idea, as an ideology, as a system, and white supremacy. It exists to be supreme. This is not to say, hashtag not all white people, I know, but it's to say that the whole concept is supremacy. So, English language teaching. See, I did have a point. What we ELT professionals are truly promising to students, even without understanding that we are doing so, is often the chance to get closer to whiteness. Whiteness, however, is an ideology that depends upon exclusion and supremacy. So this promise is doomed to be broken, and no racialized speaker of English can truly become white just by changing the way that they speak the language. So now let's get into the article. Is anything unclear? I can't see the chat. Sean, did anyone say anything that was unclear so far?
Nope, no comments so far.
All right, just making sure. Because, oh, there's something. Anyway. The centering of whiteness, oh, voice crack there. The centering of whiteness in ELT. So, little thing on the top, it's in the way, sorry. So, Kendi, we've heard, many of you read this book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and some disagree with some of the things he says in there, but the beginning of the book, when he goes through the history, is very important. The thing on the top, if you can't see it, says ulterior motives. Anyway, up here it says ulterior motives. Kendi referred to racism and capitalism as conjoined twins, and he wrote that these newborns looked up with tender eyes to their ancient siblings of sexism, imperialism, ethnocentrism, and homophobia. The point being that what we think of as racism, and when we think of whiteness and capitalism and all these things, there was obviously oppression before that. So when I make the point that these things were codified in the 16th century, it's not like before the 16th century, everybody was just getting along, right? It's just a new axis through which people could be oppressed, and more officially so. Therefore, if you're arguing like I am against the whiteness in ELT, you have to argue against the profit motive in the field. And this necessarily requires arguing against our adherence to capitalism. This is not a fully Marxist presentation, but a lot of these ideas really go along with it. So if you uncritically support profit-centric goals in our field, like sometimes I point these things out and people say, well, I got to keep the lights on. And like, okay, revenue is not the same thing as profit. So a lot of people will say, well, they're just doing that to pay the bills. But if you do that and you just accept that uncritically to justify racially oppressive policies and practices, then you're just helping whiteness remain in control. And the idea that ELT promotes these destructive values is discomforting for many, and understandably so. When I first started talking about this stuff about 1.5 years ago, people were not super hyped to talk about it. And that's why I talk about it, because it's kind of uncomfortable and we need to sort of work it out. So I'm not super into the concept of white fragility anymore, but I wrote this article 1.5 years ago, so nothing I can do about it. But basically, when people point this out, they get fragile, they get defensive, they get angry, and maybe you're not, and that's good, great. So it just means when you tell people about it, they might get that, because people who come to my presentations are usually interested in this sort of thing. When people get defensive, though, their common response is often, well, I'm going to go fix the problem myself, right? They're going to go and they say, well, I see this is really bad. I'm going to go to the school and I'm going to do everything better, right? That's when you fall into white saviorism, right? You all know, we talked a little bit about the foreign recruiting in BJ's talk, going to a place, not so much Japan, but there are a lot of places around the world that are in the global south, where people are imported to teach English, and there's a very condescending way that these things occur. That is not quite the case in Japan, because the power is a little bit different in relation to majoritized white countries, but it's not completely absent. And then there's the whole concept, my concept, of the altruistic shield. The altruistic shield basically says that people will use the image of their profession as a shield from grappling with racism and whiteness and white supremacy. So that goes for language teaching, because in the world, language teaching is seen as altruistic or pro-social or good for the world, right? And so if you're doing something that is inherently good for the world, and I point out that that's a racist system, then people will say, but I'm doing a good thing, leave me alone. Or it's not just language teaching, it's education in general. It's true for social work. It's true for medicine. It's true for a lot of things. And it makes it, I think, particularly hard to have these conversations sometimes, because people in our profession often don't want to have the conversation, because that's why they're doing it. They're doing it because they think automatically that doing this exempts them from racism as a system. So what happens though, because whiteness is centered? Well, hey, look, Ramjatan, you know that guy. Anyway, in English language teaching, you see the aesthetic labor thing. Race and language are also components in the aesthetic labor of teachers. To look good is to be white, while to sound right entails speaking an inner circle variety of English. So you heard all this last hour, but you're seeing how it comes into what I'm talking about, right? And one of the, and this is an example below, it goes to what was just said. I recall a complaint made by a parent to the clerk in 2009 that her child was being taught by a teacher of Indian descent. The teacher, who was born and raised in the UK, was a supposedly native speaker of English, perceived to be someone who speaks quote unquote with an accent because of her appearance. Now, I'm sure all of you saw I'm Black. I was hired to teach English in South Korea to start my career. I was hired because, the way those things work, I had a college degree, therefore I was qualified according to the system. But I was Black, and therefore I was told that the fact that I went to a quote unquote elite college is the only reason that I was able to get the job. I was told this unprompted by the people who hired me in Korea. So, basically they said you went to a good enough school that we didn't have to care that you were Black. So that's fun. That's how my career started. So the impact on students then, the linguistic marginalization of students of color, I know there's a lot of words on the screen, but I couldn't figure out a better way to do this, serves only to reify our extant status quo. And when we address this issue, right, we deflect and we distract and we raise that altruistic shield to avoid addressing these racial disparities in our field. Matthias explained, since the teaching force, curricula, policies, and teacher education pipeline, and that's a very important point, right, are white dominant, the context for repressed forms of violence is maintained. If disrupted, white performative recurrences of anger, avoidance, guilt, dismissal, and repression stifle race knowledge. Again, most of you, I hope, are receptive to these messages, and therefore you are not feeling this defensiveness and anger and so forth, and I appreciate that. It's when you take this message and go out to your colleagues who aren't at these conferences that you're going to see this. So, beware of that. So how do we actually decenter this though? I talk a big game about the problems, but what are the possible solutions? People always wanted me to tell them the solutions, and I tell you, it's going to take a very long time to do anything about this, but this is also what I do. So we need some structural changes, right? Journals and publications. We need dedicated space for race or racism and language to intersect. Most of the citations I have in this paper, in this presentation, when I talk about these things, I had to go all over the place and look for them. And that's part of research, right? To go into all different disciplines and journals. But if I just want to go and find, like, I want to read about racism in language, I have to go to the language place or the race place or the education place or it's a lot of work, right? And that's fine, but there's so many journals out there that are so specific that we could have several journals about this topic if we really wanted to put the work in, right? So, but it doesn't really exist, not really in a robust way. And that's part of what makes it harder for this community on race and language to be built. There's a lot of people doing good work, like some of the people who presented before me and who will present after me, but there's not that many of us, right? Conferences, well, this is a conference. So of course, having me on here and having BJ on here and Dr. Kubota, these are all people who are not white. So it's great to have panels that aren't all white, and the plenary speakers, especially, like the prominent speakers, need to not be the same people. But these are, again, the smaller organizations usually that want to make things different. And I appreciate that this is happening. Any place where I am saying these sort of things is not going to be the normal sort of place that's doing these things. So when you go to the big conferences, though, the really big ones, when they're in person again, right? Pay attention to who's presenting. And if you're called to be on a panel, see who else is on that panel. If you're white, especially, don't take that spot on a panel that's 5 white people, right? Find out who's there and make sure that you're not contributing to something unwittingly. And you'll say, well, I'm trying to move up my career. I got to get these conference presentations. So then suggest to the organizers, could you maybe add some more of et cetera? There's things you can do. A lot of us think that we can't do anything, and then that's how nothing changes. Curricula. New language teachers or old language teachers need to study race and racism. People, not just in the relationship to language, because that's important and it needs to exist. And that was my first point. But a lot of people simply need to sit down and study their conceptualizations of race. Everyone actually has a different conceptualization of race. These are just ideas, right? Race is not biological. But you need to really think about how you understand the concept of race and racism, especially if you're from a dominant racial group, especially if it's not something where racism is going to push you down personally. You need to sit with it and really do that studying. It doesn't have to be academic, right? You don't necessarily have to go read a dissertation about it. Nobody needs to read dissertations, but go and read. There's really interesting and varied books about these things. There's interesting podcasts about these things, and there's interesting articles that are written in an accessible fashion. There's no reason we shouldn't all have much better knowledge about this. Individual study. I guess the last curriculum thing was individual, but especially white teachers, but not just white teachers, need to interrogate their whiteness, or other people need to interrogate whiteness and its effect on you. If you haven't sat down, because I teach these classes, which I'll mention in a second, about whiteness to mostly, but not exclusively, white teachers. And when I ask them at the end of the first class, I say, which I'm going to ask you in a second, by the way, to think about their own whiteness or think about their own racialization, how they knew that they were in the racial category that they were in. And when I have students who are not white, they'll tell me, well, I was in 3rd grade and somebody said this to me. I was in 1st grade and somebody said this to me. Whatever. They know when it happened. They remember. And when I ask white teachers, when did you know you were white? They're like, I don't really remember. I guess I kind of noticed that people were a little bit different from me at some point, right? It's never crystal clear until they're maybe older and looking back. And that's like, I don't know that that's necessarily the kid's fault, but it is a major difference. It is a hyper awareness that racialized people have, that we have to have, and that major difference will always, be a bridge that people have to cross. So that's a really important thing that most people don't do. Race and language scholarship, the canon. First of all, as a kind of a post-structuralist, I don't think it should be a canon. But if there's going to be a canon, then the work on race and language should be right up there with your Krashen and your Chomsky and all of that. If you're in language, it should be Flores and Rosa. That's your first thing that you're reading, right? As opposed to, and I only named men there, but or Kubota and things like that need to be like right at the top of your reading list before you're really just understanding a standardized version of the language. You need to understand how language is embodied in the people that are using it. And then, as I mentioned, this stuff isn't all in one place. So you have to do interdisciplinary studying. I hope I'm not repeating myself here, but like if you don't see the work in the language teaching journals or books or whatever, then go read the books that are specifically about race and bring the race stuff into your work. A lot of people, when I talk about this stuff, they say, okay, but what do I do tomorrow in the classroom? I don't know. You got to do this work first. That's kind of a frustrating answer. I know that. But like, if I tell someone what to do tomorrow in the classroom and they haven't done this work first, they're not going to do it very well, right? It's the same way that a lot of schools after last summer have said, well, we need to start teaching different materials related to race and racism. Yes, but if you don't know how to do it, you're not going to do a good job and you might make things worse. So that is going to take you some time, and you should take that time. So my conclusion here is I do actually teach these things, so people can contact me if they want to. But the most important thing is that you have to take concerted effort to really think about how you can use whatever power you have, and you have some, all right, you have some, and maybe you need to combine with other people, and power works much better when you're combining with others to decenter whiteness in your context, whether that means your school, your organization, your community, whatever your context is. There is some lever you can pull to decenter whiteness and to lessen that power that whiteness has over the language teaching or the just teaching in general that you're involved in. This work is not going to be easy. You're going to start, you're going to stop. If I ask people to make a plan, which I do at the end of the class that I teach, and if they tell me their plan is only going to last 2 months, that's not a very good plan, right? That plan is going to need to be a year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Just this narrow thing, whiteness and language teaching, is going to take several years to be done. And that's daunting, but otherwise it's not going to happen. And the fact is, your racialized learners, your racialized colleagues, or you, if you're racialized, we can't afford to wait any longer. So when I say worth the risk, right? Is it worth the risk to make these changes to try and decenter whiteness? You know, everyone else cannot afford for us not to take the risk. So we have to start this now. Okay, so that is the main thing. I am going to, if anyone has any clarification questions first, we can do that. But afterwards, I'm going to send you all into breakout rooms and make you talk to each other. So if anyone has any clarification questions, I can scroll up in the chat. I don't know if you saw any, Shalana, any clarification.
Not specifically with clarification, although Shirley did have a question. Shirley, would you like to open up your mic and ask your question? I can't see
Hang
video,
on.
so oh, there you
Are you
are.
saying Shirley Ando?
Yes, sorry.
What did I say? I'm in the hospital right now, so I can't turn
Okay.
on my video.
Oh, that's
Okay.
You asked, oh, sorry, I was looking at the wrong spot.
Is that about the white
I'm a
fragility?
bad
That was white
moderator
fragility,
here.
I think. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Okay. But I have a question though.
Yes, please go ahead.
It must be very difficult. I'm a non-white person. I'm Filipino American. And I've been aware of my colors growing up in the US. So I'm always very conscious of what I do when I teach. I wonder how it is for white people who don't see that.
I mean, I don't know how it is for them.
I just wonder how, because you said interrogate, you're teaching, interrogate. So how would they do that? And
Well,
how can I help if I can help,
well,
or I don't know.
okay. So how can they do that? They can take my class. No, but the main thing I want them to do is really, you got to start from the beginning. Not you. They have to start from the beginning, right? Go back to like, how has the concept of race and whiteness been shaped for you before you even thought about it? Which I'm going to ask you to do in a second. And think about, high school, middle school, college, right? And you were just going about your life and most likely not having to think too much about whiteness and how that affected you. One of the things I do in my classes, I show people this picture of a corporation where all the leadership is white. And then if you go to another page on the website, you'll see that all of the advertisements for workers are using like African American English and saying like, you're going to get that cash money. So like, how does that happen, right? And people say, well, it's racism. Yeah, but there's a lot of steps in between just like what seems like cluelessness and ignorance and this nonsense. So trying to break things down into smaller pieces, people just say, well, it's racism. Okay, but what are the actual steps from point A to point Z that have led to a particular situation, whether it's in education, whether it's in employment or something like that? and see where those chains can be snapped, because they can, right? There's very few things are just one decision, right? So if you can try and take apart, so basically I'm saying a lot of things that you can all talk about in a second, but basically start from the beginning and try and see all of the ways that things have been constructed. It seems like Sonia wants to ask something next.
Thank you.
Yes. Sonia,
Yeah.
go ahead.
My question came up earlier when you mentioned very briefly white fragility, and you said that you're no longer as concerned with that, and I was wondering why.
Oh, I didn't say concerned.
Or sorry, whatever it was.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying. So I've there's been a lot of academic critique of it, and I'm of two minds on it. Part of the problem, which is not Robin DiAngelo, the author's fault, is that when all this stuff happened, that became, it was already a bestseller, but then all of a sudden white people wanted to read the white book, and then all of a sudden it's like, wait a second, it's black people that are being harmed, now this white lady's making money. Which happens a lot with diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff, is that the people leading that are often white women, just the same way that a lot of teachers are. So I don't want to necessarily center that in my analysis. And since then, I've spent more time with Black and other racialized scholars. So it's not that I don't think it's useful, but also I think the article that it's based on is better than the book. It has all the same ideas. So, but part of it is just like, I would not have it as central to my argument now as it was when I wrote it back then. That's all I was saying.
We
Thank
also
you.
have a question from Nancy, if we've got time for maybe one more question.
Yeah, and then we have to go into rooms.
Perfect.
Hey, thanks very much. I was just really interested to know when you became interested in your current research topic in like decentralizing why, and whether or not you had similar ideas before living and working in South Korea, and that, or how long were you working in the or living there for, and what kind of influences that had on you as a scholar, researcher, and as a person. I'm just interested, if that's okay.
I can talk for several hours about that.
Yeah, I would love to know.
So I'll give you like a 1-minute version of that. To
Okay.
answer a basic question, I was in South Korea from 2008, 2010. It was only 2 years, and that was the beginning of my career, so that was a while ago. I was not thinking about whiteness specifically back then. I wasn't even thinking so much about whiteness when I started my doctorate a few years ago. Obviously, I'd had many experiences with racism and with white people. I was in predominantly white schools my whole life, and mostly exclusive, elite, expensive type schools. And, I was sort of raised, it was hinted that I was raised at the, like, if you work hard, you can achieve your way out of racism kind of thing that happens to, certainly upwardly mobile Black people in the United States. But then every time, like, you can't really get away from whiteness. So in retrospect, I have realized that most of my adolescence and my education in general was, several decades of data on whiteness and certain types of white people who don't think that they are racist. And then I started researching language after I got into my doctorate, and I asked a question just about race, and people got really uncomfortable. And I said, that's my research. Why they're so uncomfortable? So that's what happened. I basically was like, I started pulling threads of discomfort, and that's how this happened. Okay, so yeah, no problem. Let me, how do the breakout rooms, recreate rooms? Okay. There are 60 of you. So the rooms have been created.
And
And
questions before you put us in.
Oh, I should put them here. Yes. So let me do that. I'm going to put the questions down here, and then you need to discuss them we have 20 minutes left. So you're going to discuss these questions for about 10 minutes total. So try to do, I don't know, 3 minutes per question. There's only 3 of them. Yeah. Okay. These are the questions, and I shall send you to your rooms. Bye. Or I'll be in your rooms, but okay. I think we just hit the 60-second countdown. Okay, so we got about 8 minutes. A couple of things before we get just open to everyone and some points because I didn't get to go to all. It's too many rooms for me to go to all of them in 10 minutes. And then if someone's literally telling me something, I'm not gonna be like, no, bye. I saw an interesting thread that may have come up in more than one room about, the articles, that's easy to share. The concept that for a lot of places, like the reason I talk about the word racialized is that these concepts shift depending on context, right? If you are in a country, for example, where there just aren't very many white people, which is Japan, or if you're in a place like if you're in the Dominican Republic or something, where again, most of the people are not white, although that doesn't mean whiteness doesn't have an impact. The concept of the way people are racialized is very different, right? The issue of whiteness and anti-blackness is a global issue. These are global issues, and racism is still a thing, but it's very different in each place. And I can't speak directly to each context, and no one should pretend to. But that's why I think the word racialized is really powerful and valuable, because same thing that BJ was saying about different parts of Europe, like who is in what race, or what even races are called, is different from place to place. When I say I'm Black, I'm trying to call it to a global diaspora, but there are people who I would, if I had to think of how to describe them, I would think of them as Black, but they would tell me, no, that's not, no, I'm from this country, I'm not Black. Which to me, I'm just like, but you're still, come on, we're in the same community, come on, man. But I get it. The point is these identities are up to the people who have them. And one of the things about racialization that is unfortunate is, and the reason that we have to do so much work, is that the racialization has been placed upon us, and especially in as much as it would prefer not to be a multiracial society like the United States, you can't just call upon the nationality and use that as talking about the race, as much as people, storming the Capitol would pretend otherwise. So if we have other questions that people would like to share, we got a few minutes, 5 of them, 5 minutes. This would be the time to do that. I don't know if Shalana wants to moderate or something.
Nancy had a question from before we went into the breakout rooms. If you'd like to ask now, Nancy.
Apologies. The questions I asked, Jared has answered already. But basically, if there's more time, I was just interested, in how his life in South Korea, and how that kind of had impact on how he is seeing his research at the moment. So because we didn't have time earlier, and we kind of went into the breakout room. So if Jerry want to share more of a little bit of his life stories, or
just I give my email and my Twitter account there, we can talk, because I could do that forever. I mean, that doesn't mean that I don't care. I'm just saying, trust me, I will talk forever, but you can just contact me and I will tell you everything. So there you go. Okay, we have Avril raised her hand.
I did. Hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. And today has, it's just been great so far. In our group, we actually talked a lot more about how we kind of exist within these sort of very white spaces. And, I shared my frustration sometimes with, obviously being the only one or one of few talking about these issues within ELT, especially within the Japanese context. Ryuko gave me a great suggestion about being surrounded by like-minded people. But what I'm interested with you is when you come up against that wall, as you said, there are many people who do not want to talk about racism. They're very uncomfortable that they may be perpetuating these ideas in their daily lives and practices. So what do you do when you come up against that wall? I think I'm asking more from a personal level, because as you know, these things can be very exhausting. So how do we keep going? What's your advice?
It's a story I tell, and thank you for that question, because I think it's useful, especially for anyone in the audience who is not white and has to try to deal with these things. Ryuko's suggestion to you is valuable, having a community, but you know that. And when in 2019, when conferences in person were a thing, I went to Toronto, where I also met BJ, and I was starting to really talk about these things more often, right? And I took a picture of somebody's like slide with permission to just like share it, and I put it on social media, and it was a picture of a language learner who had been, placed in a disability category. I'm gonna get to the point, don't worry. And I'm telling everybody that because I don't have much time. And placed in disability category, and I said, wow, teachers can be gross. And then someone just came out of the woodwork to talk about how teachers work hard and so on. And I'm just like, what does that have to do with anything? I didn't say anything about you. And I went outside of the presentation and I sat down and I talked to somebody who just seemed to be researching these things. And she said, very quickly assess whether the person really wants to have a good faith conversation and then get out. That's it. You just don't do it. Don't do it. If people are having a bad faith conversation, especially since most things are online right now, I just call in my community, right? And like literally a month ago, as some people who follow me saw, there were just a couple of white guys having some problems with me on the internet. And I just said, white followers, because asking this of fellow followers of color, I said, white followers, please handle this. And they did. And that was nice to see. It ended up being affirming rather than distressing. So thank you. If someone has to have a final question, and then I'll sign off. I'll answer it very quickly. Yeah, a great question. Anyone have a last thing?
Final question? Okay.
Oh, all right. So as far as the article is concerned, I mean, it's easy to get to. I can put it in the links. And you'll get the presentation as well. Although honestly, the presentation kind of is the article with aside from the context about the definitions at the beginning. And anyone who's interested, my email is there too, and my Twitter account. And just announced I am writing a book about all of this stuff over the next couple of years. So you can pick that up in 2023. So I have to wait on that one. But thank you for paying attention. And I was glad to have this conversation with all of you.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Everyone, please give a round of applause or click the little button. Thank you so much.